Today we will learn and reflect on the history of the Civil War and how runaway black slaves helped the Union persevere and triumph, with ex-slaves serving as soldiers, spies, and laborers. Our main sources are the Yale lectures on black history and also Civil War and Reconstruction. And Yale has published the undergraduate class lectures for Professors Holloway and Blight. These are over 4 dozen lectures in total. And we took the best stories from these lectures to encourage you to listen to the full set of lectures. And they're also spellbinding. These were such violent times, and blacks were prone to such cruelties, that these videos have a disclaimer for those who have difficulty handling this violence. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along with our PowerPoint scripts we uploaded to SlideShare. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. When the war began, Lincoln insisted that the war needed to be fought to preserve the Union. Lincoln said that if he could abolish slavery and save the Union, he would do that. And if he could preserve slavery and save the Union, he would do that. But why would Union soldiers volunteer to fight to preserve the Union? According to Professor Gallagher of the Teaching Company, the sentiment was that Lincoln won the presidency fair and square, and that you just cannot succeed because your side lost the election. And the U.S. was a democratic beacon shining over the monarchical regimes in Europe. And Americans took great pride in their fledgling democracy and were serious about preserving the Union. But preserving the Union really was about slavery. Northerners were against admitting new states into the Western territories as slave states. The various compromises negotiated were either overturned by events or by the Supreme Court. The Free Soil movement sought to keep the territories free because the slave plantations with free labor were unfair competition for the yeoman farmer. Even if Lincoln had sought a peace treaty with the Confederacy, what would happen to these Western territories? Many informed observers at the time felt that civil war was inevitable because of the competition between free and slave states for these new territories. And we have a companion video for our Yale lecture notes on slavery and the abolitionists. And some of the sources for the tension before the Civil War included the constant abolitionist rhetoric, the enforcement of fugitive slave laws. Slave traders would go north and just kidnap any black person they saw, whether they were runaway slaves or freedmen. And we have John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and John Brown really was an abolitionist terrorist. And we have the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this novel had slaves as unlikely heroes. Lincoln was forced into the war because the Confederacy would not permit Northern ships to resupply Fort Sumter. Lincoln wanted to resupply the fort not with munitions but with food and water. Southern cannons fired on the fort in the Bay of Charleston, South Carolina, and it was the first state to secede from the Union. At the beginning of the war, both sides anticipated, and maybe hoped is a better word, that the war would last only a few more months. But month after month, battle after battle, armies advanced, then retreated. The casualties mounted battle by battle, with no end in sight. But the soldiers from the North were far easier to replace. The South would lose in a war of attrition, especially since most of the battles were fought on Southern soil. The North had far more manufacturing, more railroads of the same gauge, and a far larger population. In the beginning, the South had the better generals, and General Robert E. Lee was always a brilliant tactician. But there was good and bad generals on both sides. Although the Northern General McClellan would incessantly drill the raw recruits in the Northern Army, he was a cautious general, and he let victory slip through his grasp many times after a hard-fought, bloody battle. McClellan was not an abolitionist. He was a peace Democrat, and he actually ran against Lincoln in the next presidential election. And here we have one of the rare Civil War photos of Abraham Lincoln visiting the camp with General McClellan and his staff. And soon after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln would fire General McClellan for his reluctance to fight and failure to capitalize on whatever victories he had. But General Grant, on the Western Theater, would win a major victory at Vicksburg, and that gave the Union control over the mighty Mississippi River. And Grant would continually flank Lee until Lee was cornered and surrendered at Appomattox, while the Northern General Sherman burned Atlanta and marched to the sea. The Southern Army was never well provisioned. David Blight says this of Lee's army when they invaded Maryland for the Battle of Antietam. Lee's army was not very well fed, and they weren't very well clad. Here's one description of a young Marylander who saw the Confederate army. He said it was nothing but a set of ragamuffins. It seemed as if every cornfield in Maryland had been robbed of its scarecrows. None had any underclothing. My costume consisted of a ragged pair of trousers, a stained dirty jacket, an old slouch hat, the brim pinned up with a thorn, a bee-grimed blanket over my shoulder, a grease-smeared cotton haversack full of apples and corn, a cartridge box full, and a musket. I was barefooted. I had a stone bruise on each foot. There was no one there in this army who would not have been run in by the police had he appeared on the streets of a normal city. And there's plenty of testimony in the record, although a lot of young Maryland men came out to see this now famous army of Robert E. Lee. But they took one look and one smell, as one put it, and went back to their farms. Robert E. Lee will get almost no real recruits out of Maryland. What he will do in Maryland is capture several hundred slaves and return them or take them to Virginia. They're going to do the same thing in 1863 in the Gettysburg Campaign on even a larger scale. Kidnapping ex-slaves was part of the Confederate Army's job. From the beginning of the war, every time the Union forces advanced into the South, escaped slaves would cross the Union lines. Some returned to their masters in the beginning of the war, but most were confiscated as contraband of war. Most of them were put to work doing menial labor for the Union Army, but some of them served as scouts and spies and soldiers for the Union forces. Photography had just been invented, and photography was so primitive that you had to stay still for several minutes. Well, you can't take pictures of the active battlefield, but you could take pictures of the dead after the battle was fought. Many Southerners thought if they treated their house slaves or urban slaves well, that they would readily accept slavery as their lot in life. David Blight tells a story of one such slave who escapes to the Union lines. Back in Virginia, there was a young slave, 22 years old. His name was John Washington. He'd grown up in Fredericksburg, Virginia. He had a white father whom he had never known, and a slave mother named Sarah, who taught him how to read and write. He grew up as an urban slave with lots of skills, highly valued, probably a brilliant young man. He was hired out many times as an independent artisan before the war. He married his sweetheart in January 1862 in the African Baptist Church in Fredericksburg. He chose his moment of escape at the first appearance of Union forces along the Rappahannock River in Fredericksburg in 1862. John, then 22 years old, tells a story of all the white people evacuating Fredericksburg and how his mistress, Mrs. Tolliver, is literally packing her china and her silver, and she says to John, "Now, John, you'll be with us tomorrow. You'll be with us tomorrow." She's assuming his loyalty, and he says, "Yes, missus. Yes, missus, I'll be with you tomorrow." Then he goes to the hotel where he's been hired out as a steward. He took the 12 black workers up on the roof of the hotel, where they could see across the river the gleam of the Yankees' bayonets. And they brought them all back down into the kitchen, and he poured a round of drinks, and he held a toast. And the toast was, "To the Yankees." And then he instructed his fellow workers. He said, to get out of there, but don't get too far from the Yankees. John Washington spent the rest of the summer as a camp hand and guide for the Union Army, all the way through the Battle of Second Manassas. Now, if you hadn't seen the movie Harriet, released in 2019 about Harriet Tubman, the escaped slave and Underground Railroad conductor, it's a movie well worth seeing. It is a movie about Harriet Tubman, the escaped slave and Underground Railroad conductor who repeatedly risked her life rescuing hundreds of slaves in the Deep South. You must really see the movie. As with all movies, there are a few exaggerations, and at the end of the movie, they concoct a scene enabling her to give a Thucydides speech to her grieved former master. But in real life, her incredible bravery and determination could never be exaggerated. Harriet Tubman also assisted the Union Army in their invasions of the South. Harriet was the first woman to lead an armed assault during the Civil War. This is from Wikipedia. When Union troops were planning attacks on the South Carolina plantations, Tubman served as a key advisor and accompanied the raid. On the morning of June 2, 1863, Tubman guided 3 steamboats around Confederate mines in the waters leading up to the shore. Once ashore, the Union troops set fire to the plantations, destroying infrastructure and seizing thousands of dollars worth of food and supplies. While the steamboats sounded their whistles, slaves throughout the area understood that they were being liberated, and Tubman watched as slaves stampeded towards the boats. "I never saw such a sight," she said later, describing a scene of chaos with women carrying still steaming pots of rice, pigs squealing in bags slung over shoulders, and babies hanging around their parents' necks. Although their owners, armed with handguns and whips, tried to stop the mass escape, their efforts were nearly useless in the tumult. As Confederate troops raced to the scene, the Union steamboats steamed north, packed full of ex-slaves. David Bly tells a story about an escaped slave named George Hatton, who had advanced to sergeant in the colored troops when his regiment was encamped near Jamestown, Virginia. Into the Union lines came several freed black women, who all declared that they had recently been severely whipped by a master. Members of Hatton's company managed to capture that slave owner, a certain Mr. Clayton, the man who had administered the beatings on these women. This white Virginian was stripped to the waist. He was tied to a tree, and he was given 20 lashes by one of his former slaves, a man named William Harris, who is now a member of the Union Army. In turn, each of the women that Clayton had beaten were given the whip and a chance to lay their lash on this slaveholder's back. And these women were given leave to remind him that they were no longer his, but safely housed in Abraham's bosom and under the protection of the Star-Spangled Banner and guarded by their own patriotic, though once downtrodden race. In Hatton's letter, he once again felt a loss for words to describe the transformation he was witnessing. "Oh, that I had the tongue to express my feelings," he wrote, while standing on the banks of the James River on the soil of old Virginia, the mother state of slavery, as a witness of such a sudden reverse. "The day is clear, the fields of grain are beautiful, and the birds are singing sweet melodious songs, while poor Mr. Clayton is crying to his servants for mercy from his whippings." As the number of these escaped slaves increased and the need for additional Union soldiers likewise increased, Lincoln and the generals began to ask themselves, why not induct these former slaves into the army? They would be eager to bear arms against the masters who had so often whipped and humiliated them. To win the war, Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, shared it with his cabinet, and then pocketed the document until the fortunes of war improved for the North. After the victory at the Battle of Antietam and Grant's victory at Vicksburg, Lincoln released the Emancipation Proclamation as an executive order issued under his war powers as Commander-in-Chief in September 1862. What the Emancipation Proclamation did not do was emancipate any slaves immediately, nor did it emancipate the slaves in the border states loyal to the Union cause. Lincoln proclaimed that if the Confederacy surrendered by January 1st, 1863, she could keep her slaves. But if the rebellion persisted after that date, all slaves in the rebelling states would be free. And this Harper's Weekly illustration shows what the free blacks saw in emancipation. No longer would they be whipped. No longer would they be abused. They could now vote. They and their children could attend school, learn how to read, and have a house, and have a family in their house, and have a real life of their own. And Professor Blight says that there were at least 4 immediate and visible effects of the Emancipation Proclamation. First, every forward movement the Union armies now would, whether some of the officers liked it or not, liberate more slaves. Second, news of the proclamation, whatever the details in the fine print, would spread like wildfire across the South, and it would attract towards the Union more freed people. We have testimony of Confederate soldiers and white Southerners saying that they first heard about the Emancipation Proclamation from their slaves. Third, it committed the United States government in the eyes of the world to emancipation. And that's terribly important when we remember that Great Britain was on the verge of recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Fourth, Lincoln formally authorized, once and for all, although it's already begun to happen, the recruitment of black men into the Union armies and navy. And it authorizes a formal process now to recruit black men into the Union uniform. And before the war will end, about 10% of all Union forces will be African American, approximately 180,000 soldiers, 80% of whom were former slaves from the slave states. After the Emancipation Proclamation, 2 years into the war under Lincoln, Congress passed the Conscription Act, and that was America's first national draft act. The draft was controversial everywhere in the North, especially in New York City. Of all northern cities, New York City had the closest economic ties to the South. New York was the center of the cotton trade with Europe. Many New Yorkers were sympathetic to the Southern cause. Professor Holloway says this: in response to the Union draft, several days of rioting began in New York City. The military command, the commandant of the region, anything embodying military or suggesting police control, is targeted by the rioters. They're targeted by largely ethnic Irish gangs, and they also targeted blacks. The commandant calls for more troops, and when the dust settles, As many as 1,000 people died during these riots. And our professor continues, these were bloody riots. We're not talking about gangs throwing rocks and beating each other up. We're talking about lynchings. In total, 11 people are lynched during several days of riots. A few examples. Joseph Reed, separated from his mother and grandmother, he's beaten to death. He's 7 years old. William Williams, a sailor, is assaulted by longshoremen, the dock workers, when he asks for the directions, not knowing that this riot is happening. Someone picks up a cobblestone, hurls the stone at him, and someone else stabs him. The crowd cheers and starts chanting, "Don't hire niggers! Don't hire niggers!" And our professor continues. The Colored Orphanage, a very large building there to take care of abandoned children. The crowd sees this place as threatening, something the blacks have that the Irish don't. So they set the orphanage on fire. Thankfully, the staff and children were able to escape out the back as the building is being torched. On the third day of riots, Abraham Franklin, a disabled black coachman, and his sister Henrietta were pulled out of their boarding room and lynched. Now there's one thing I forgot to mention that's important. Blacks and Irish were at each other's throat throughout the riots, but they're living in the same areas. They're interacting all the time. And that's what makes this story that much more horrific. Now after the riots, Lincoln decides to leave New York City alone and quietly discontinues the compulsory draft in the city. Lincoln reasons that as long as the rest of the country thinks New York City is pulling its weight in the war, that's all that matters. David Blight relates another incredible story about the young slave Wallace Turner, whose spirit was never broken as he was savagely beaten and mistreated following 4 failed attempts to escape to freedom. Now Wallace Turner was sold to a Richmond, Virginia slave trader named Hector Davis. He spent about 6 months in 1860 working in 3-story slave jail auction house in Richmond. His job every day was preparing the slaves in what was called the dressing room to take them to the auction floor. But then one day he simply told, "Boy, you're in the auction today." And he was sold to an Alabama cotton planter named James Chalmers. And the narrative he left us is the story of his 5 attempts to escape in the midst of the bloody Civil War. The story of a half-crazed teenage slave who just couldn't be controlled. And our professor tells us, Wallace ran away 4 times into Mississippi, always trying to get up to northern Mississippi to get to the Union armies. One time he was at large for 4.5 months, hiding in other slave cabins and hiding in the woods and forests and gullies, wherever he could hide. He almost reached the big contraband camp in Corinth on his 4th try, but he was captured by slave patrols. His master would always come after him because he was so valuable. His master Chalmers now got fed up of constantly trying to retrieve this kid, so he took him down to Mobile, Alabama, selling him in 1863 for $2,000, which is the price today of a good Mercedes-Benz car. Wallace's 5th and final escape attempt came after a vicious beating. He had been beaten many more times than he could count, and he had been put in neck braces and leg chains and ankle chains and wrist chains, and he had experienced about every kind of brutality slavery could bring on a teenage kid. One day he crashed his master's carriage, and the master got so angry that he took him to the slave jail, hired the jailer to give him 30 lashes with the ugliest whip they had, a whip that would make you bleed on every lash. At the end of it, he's standing there naked, bleeding, and his master says, "Go home." But instead of going home, he put his clothes back on and walked straight through the Confederate Army, a garrison of about 10,000 troops, where he was no doubt simply mistaken for yet another black camp hand. At dusk, he just crossed through the Confederate camp and walked out of Mobile. And his final escape is a 3-week trek, which he narrates in remarkable ways. A 3-week trek down the western shore of Mobile Bay for 25 miles, through a snake and an alligator-infested swamp, now known as the Foul River Estuary. Wallace describes one day praying especially hard when he got out to the tip of Mobile Bay, and the tide brought in an old rickety rowboat, and he tipped over the rowboat, took a plank of wood, and he just started rowing out into the ocean. And in quite dramatic form, he describes how a wave is about to swamp his little boat, and he hears oars. And the oars were a Union gunboat with 8 sailors. They say, "Jump in." He jumped in, and he said as he sat down in their boat, he said the Yankee sailors were struck with silence as they looked at him, wondering who he was and how he got there. They took him to a Sand Island fort and clothed him and fed him. These were the first kind of acts by a white person that 17-year-old Turnage had ever experienced. The next day they took him to Fort Gaines on Dauphin Island. That is where the big beautiful sandbar island is out of the mouth of the Mobile Bay, and he was brought before the Union commander of all forces in the area, Gordon Granger, who interrogated him for intelligence about Mobile. and General Granger gave him two choices. He could either join a black regiment that was forming at that very time in the Gulf region, or he could become a servant to a white officer. Now Wallace chose the latter. He didn't tell us why. Perhaps he'd suffered enough. He'd seen enough of his own war with the Confederates. So he served out the war for another year as the mess cook for a captain from a Maryland regiment whose name was Junius Turner. And Wallace was with that regiment in Baltimore, Maryland in August 1865 when it was mustered out. And Wallace lived 3 years in Baltimore and then moved to New York City, where he lived the rest of his life until 1916. He was lucky to find his mother and his 4 siblings, and they were all living in a tenement house, surviving as part of that first generation of a black working class, former slaves in a northern city. He lived till 1916 and is buried in the Cypress Hill Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. And the point of the story is that these slaves escaping were real people with real names, real family, real hopes and desires. And now we'll talk about the sources we used for this video. Jonathan Holloway was a Yale professor whose chosen academic field is Black history, a topic he chose as a teenager. And these are his undergraduate lectures on Afro-American history. And you can see the first 4 to 6 lectures are about the slavery and the Civil War, and after that his lectures are mostly about the Civil Rights struggle. But Professor Blight's lectures on the Civil War and Reconstruction era between 1845 and 1877, they have a different perspective. He gives us more background on Southern culture for the first few lectures. It may go a little slow, but be patient. The following history lectures quickly pick up the pace. He covers many topics on the Civil War in detail, including the economics of both North and South, life at the home front, North and South, turning points in the war, a deep dive into the effects of emancipation, and wartime reconstruction. And in the third of our lectures on Yale lecture notes, we'll have a video on Reconstruction, Redemption, KKK, and Jim Crow era. And we were not planning on doing a blow-by-blow, bloody battle account of the Civil War, but then we realized, wow, there are all these incredible Civil War paintings and full-color lithographs of all these battles. Now, photography had just been invented. Perhaps the American painters realized, our days are numbered. We need to paint as many paintings as we can now, and so they did. And of course, the newspapers of the day demanded these lithographs for their illustrations. So we changed our mind, and our main other source, the Teaching Company lectures by Professor Gallagher, also cover many of the moral aspects of the war against slavery. So this video will be coming out in a month or so after this video in 2022. The YouTube description links to the video script and our blog. Please support our channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons, and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. And please click on the links for interesting videos on other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.